January 1943. Pre-dawn hours in the Bismarck Sea. The ocean lay deceptively calm, its surface barely disturbed except for the low hum of a Japanese convoy cutting through the darkness. Tankers heavy with crude oil and aviation fuel moved in disciplined formation, guarded by destroyers whose crews believed the deep waters beneath them offered safety. Below that surface, unseen and patient, an American submarine adjusted its depth and listened. The soft, rhythmic thrum of propellers carried through steel hull and seawater alike. That sound, fuel-laden ships moving steadily forward, became the recurring symbol of what Japan could not afford to lose. For the Japanese Navy, oil was not merely a resource, it was survival. Unlike the United States, Japan possessed almost no domestic petroleum reserves. Every battleship, every carrier, every aircraft relied on fuel transported thousands of miles from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The Imperial Navy was built on the assumption that these lifelines would remain intact long enough to win a decisive battle. What Japanese commanders did not anticipate was how ruthlessly American submarines would sever those arteries. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese planners expected submarine warfare to play only a limited role. Their doctrine focused on decisive fleet engagements, not sustained commerce destruction. Submarines were meant to weaken enemy fleets, not dismantle supply networks. Japanese commanders assumed the Americans, like themselves, would prioritize capital ships over tankers. Oilers were considered secondary targets, protected but not expected to be hunted relentlessly. Reality shattered those expectations. American submarine doctrine evolved rapidly after the early setbacks of 1942. Once faulty torpedoes were corrected and command leadership improved, U.S. submarines began operating with devastating efficiency. By mid-1943, American boats were no longer merely hunting warships, they were stocking fuel. Official U.S. Navy records show that tankers and oilers became priority targets, identified as the most strategically valuable vessels afloat. One submarine commander later noted that sinking an oiler could disable an entire fleet without firing a shot at its warships. Japanese commanders soon noticed a terrifying pattern. Fleets arrived late to operations, training exercises were shortened or canceled altogether, carrier air groups reduced flight hours, battleships remained at anchor longer than planned. The sound of tanker engines, once a reassurance of continuity, began to disappear from Japanese naval schedules. Each missing convoy represented not just ships lost, but mobility stolen. The emotional contrast deepened as Japanese officers compared expectation with reality. They had believed that their naval skill, discipline, and early victories would compensate for material inferiority. They expected fuel shortages to be temporary inconveniences, not structural collapse. Instead, American submarines turned the Pacific into a hunting ground where oil ships were systematically erased from the sea. Historical records confirm the scale of the disaster. By the end of 1944, U.S. submarines, representing less than 2% of the American Navy, were responsible for sinking over 55% of Japanese merchant shipping. Oil tankers suffered disproportionately. Japanese Ministry of War statistics reveal that oil transport capacity dropped by more than 80% between 1941 and 1945. Even when oil reached Japan, it often arrived too late or in insufficient quantity to matter. Captured Japanese naval documents reflect disbelief and frustration. One internal report admitted that the enemy has struck at the root of naval power. Another lamented that warships now existed as iron without blood. The metaphor was painfully accurate. Battleships without fuel were monuments, not weapons. Carriers without aviation gasoline were floating airfields without aircraft. The recurring symbol, the oil tanker's engines, took on grim meaning. Their absence was louder than any explosion. Japanese sailors spoke of silent harbors where fleets waited endlessly for fuel that never came. Training manuals emphasized conservation over readiness. Crews drilled without sailing. The Navy that once prided itself on precision and offensive spirit became increasingly immobilized. For American submariners, the mission carried its own emotional weight. Patrol after patrol meant weeks submerged, stalking slow-moving targets that rarely fought back. Yet, they understood the strategic importance of their work. Every tanker sunk shortened the war. Every plume of black smoke on the horizon marked another step towards strangling Japan's ability to fight. The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking was profound. Commanders who once envisioned decisive fleet battles were forced to accept a war of attrition they could not win. Fuel scarcity reshaped ideology. Risk aversion replaced bold maneuver. Operations were delayed or abandoned entirely. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Japan's expansion, became tethered to ports, conserving fuel for a final battle that would never arrive in the form they imagined. By 1945, the consequences were undeniable. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese task forces sailed with barely enough fuel to reach the battlefield, knowing there would be no return. Some commanders openly acknowledged that their ships were being sent on one-way missions not out of strategy, but because fuel no longer justified preservation. The absence of oil dictated destiny. And through it all, the symbolism remained stark. Oil, black, liquid, unglamorous, proved more decisive than armor or guns. The American submarines did not defeat Japan through spectacle, but through silence and patience. They listened, waited, and struck at the moment when Japan's lifeline passed overhead. In the epilogue of this story, the lesson extends beyond the Pacific. Power in modern war was no longer measured solely by courage or skill, but by logistics, industry, and the protection of supply. The United States, rich in resources and industrial depth, understood that abundance itself could be a weapon. Democracy, when mobilized, produced not only ships and submarines, but the fuel to sustain them indefinitely. The stunned realization faced by Japanese commanders was not merely that tankers were sinking, it was that their war had been decided far from the battlefield, in the dark depths where American submarines rewrote the meaning of naval power. Oils stopped flowing, engines fell silent, and with them faded the illusion that will alone could overcome the realities of modern industrial warfare. In the end, the Pacific was not conquered by a single battle, but by the quiet disappearance of fuel beneath the waves.